Hello, and the warmest of welcomes indeed to this afternoon's iOB business webinar. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on here. My name is Ben, and I'm the resident business coach here at iOB Business. Now, if this is your first time joining us, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you virtually, of course. And if you're joining us again, it's absolutely wonderful to see so many familiar faces coming back on with us. And we really, really appreciate it, as always. Okay, so today's topic, failure is your guide. Now, perhaps contrary to popular belief, this is something that very, very important that we cover because failure is actually looked at in a very negative sense. And we'd actually love to look through that, maybe debunk some of the myths and look forward into how we can actually use failure as a guide going forward. Okay, now if this is one of your first time joining us on one of these iOB business webinars, a little bit about how they run right before we get kicked off. Okay, so once again, my name is Ben, and I do a brief introduction with you for a few minutes just before we get kicked off whilst waiting for everybody to join. Now, throughout today's presentation, which we're going to dive onto in just a second, we're going to run through that for around about 15 to 20 minutes or so. Now, we're going to cover three topics as we always do, and you're more than welcome in between each topic or at any time really to jot down any notes and indeed ask any questions. Now, we're going to give you a moment in between each of the three topics to do this, but just in case, it's good to let you know where these things are. Okay, so there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. It should be a kind of gray box there for you to access. If you want to ask any questions, we always have a few, so please feel free to ask away with those. You're more than welcome to do so. Okay, so whilst we get kicked off at today's session, let's get you up on screen. There we go. Perfect. So what I'm going to do now is switch off my video camera. So you shouldn't be able to see me anymore, but you should still be able to see the presentation up on screen, and you should still be able to hear my voice. All right. Now, if you could do me a big favor, please, right before we get kicked off on today's session, and just let me know that you can hear my voice okay, and that you can indeed see the screen okay. So what you should be able to see now is a blue presentation screen saying failure is your guide, the title of today's webinar. Okay, now let us get started. All right, perfect. So thank you for the confirmation. Excellent. Okay, so we are good to go. So today's topic, without further ado, let's get into it. Failure is your guide. Okay, now your presenter is myself. My name is Ben, and I'm a professional business coach. Okay, I specialize in working with small businesses, just like many of you that are on today, helping them to achieve stability and growth. Okay, now whether you're an experienced digital marketing agency owner, whether you're a prospect agency owner, maybe it's something you're looking to get into, or maybe you've just started, this webinar is for you. And really, this webinar is to enjoy business elements as a whole, because we're talking about such a broad topic. Okay, so in today's session, we're going to cover three things as we always do. Number one, the rule. Okay, and we're going to cover three separate elements. They're going to be divided so that we can talk about each one in detail. Number one, we're going to talk about the rule. Don't be afraid to fail. The concept, you must fail in order to progress. So the concept of the logic, what is it? What does it mean? And finally, the outcome, what happens in the end scenario, increased experience and eventual success. And we're going to talk about what that means as well. All right, so getting kicked off with topic number one today, the rule. So first things first, many don't even begin due to fear of failure. Now, this may begin to sound awfully familiar as we begin to speak through today's session. Okay, now, if it is familiar, wonderful. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And if it isn't, good for you. That's also great. But what we need to discuss is throughout the lifespan of your business, throughout any business that you run, throughout the lifespan of your digital agencies, we need to make sure that we're discussing topics like this because they're so important. And often, in my personal belief, they're not talked about enough. Okay, failure is something that can be looked at in such a negative light that we actually develop this paralyzing fear and anxiety of doing something because we're so worried about what the result's going to be, instead of looking at the positive. Okay, so yes, okay, maybe you could lose some money. Okay, now there's calculations, there's risk mitigation for that to make sure that you don't lose too much. Maybe things could go a little bit wrong, but you also have to consider that they could go right. They could go very right. They could go very well. All right, now we need to look at both sides of the coin here, but the salient point here to begin with today's presentation is that many don't even begin due to their fear of failure. Now, this is such a sad concept to look at in human life, that we don't approach things, we don't approach obstacles and concepts and developments and ideas because we're paralyzed by the fact that, well, if this goes wrong, I'm going to be embarrassed, I'm going to be hurt, I'm going to be disappointed, I'm going to be sad, I'm going to be upset. What we need to do is we need to begin to look at the positives as well. Okay, it might be that, but it could also be this. So many don't even begin due to the fear of failure. Now, it is believed that failure is embarrassing or demeaning. Now, I don't know off the top of my head, and you can do your research on this if you like, but every single successful entrepreneur that you know in today's world, okay, so we've got Jeff Bezos, founder and owner of Amazon, Elon Musk, he's got Tesla, okay, he's got enormous aerospace company behind him, okay, as does, ironically, as does Jeff Bezos, okay. Now, we look at people like this, Richard Branson, he's a British example, okay. These people didn't just become hyper successful overnight. Now, success is defined differently by everybody that uses the word, but for the most part, I think we can look at success here, you know, as, okay, they've established and achieved what they wanted to achieve in life. You know, maybe they're still aiming for something else, but you could say that they're very well accomplished, very well achieved in what they look to set out to do in their lives, okay? Now, if they were to take the viewpoint that failure is embarrassing and demeaning, you could probably take an educated guess and say, well, there's a good chance that they wouldn't be where they are now. They wouldn't be enjoying the kind of lifestyle that they do now. They wouldn't be anywhere near as accomplished or as successful as they are now, okay? Because if they were too scared to do something, they were too scared to take a chance and see what kind of developments could happen because of the embarrassment or the potential demeaning situation that could have come across, they really wouldn't be who they are today. Okay, so it is believed that failure is embarrassing or demeaning. I would love to debunk this myth with you. Okay, failure is not embarrassing. Do you know what failure says to me and says to many, many other entrepreneurs? It says that you tried something. It says that you're going to pick yourself back up and you're going to try something again. If it didn't work out the first time, try the second time. If it didn't work the second time, try the third time. People go through so many different levels of experimentation and trying and adjusting and changing things and adaptations to figure out what eventually works. They could have 100 failures behind them, but all it takes is that one success. Okay. Now, if you quit after your first mistake, you will then guarantee non-progression. The only way to make sure that you absolutely don't achieve anything new is by never trying. So if you try something once and you drop it and you say, oh, well, that didn't work. Okay. Now, the hindsight that I love to use here is that many of us look back on our lives and say, oh, if I'd have just done this, if I'd have just done that. And failure is something that's attached to this because we say to ourselves, well, I failed in this, I failed in that, but if I'd have just done something differently, if I'd have just done that. Now, hindsight and retrospect, it's much easier to look back on something because you can't remember the situational experience. You can't remember exactly how it felt to be there. You can't remember exactly what that situation was like. So it's much easier to navigate and say, oh, well, actually, if I'd just done these few things, that probably would have been a success. Okay, so two things are kicking in there. First thing is experience from an initial failure. You've learned lessons, clearly. That's why you're using your hindsight to essentially problem solve retrospective questions. Now, a second element that's happening here is you're reminiscing over something that could have been instead of focusing on what is. Okay, now many of us could look back on previous business ventures, previous personal decisions, maybe they didn't work out, but we say, well, if I'd have just tried this, that probably would have worked. Now, whether that is true or isn't true is irrelevant now because you don't know, because you cannot rewind the clock and go back to where you were then. What you can do is take the experience learned, take that hindsight and actually develop it into something to carry you forward instead of looking back. Okay, so if you quit after your first mistake, you will guarantee non-progression. The only way to truly guarantee that you don't do anything is by doing nothing. You will not achieve anything new if you don't try. Okay, now the fear of failure is often higher than the chance of failure. Okay, now this is not a statistic and it's not a report and it's not based on any metrics. It's simply the fact that often the fear of failing in something is higher than the actual chance of failure. Why? Because largely you control that dice. You make sure which way the dice rolls based on your effort, based on your education, based on what you're willing to do to make it work. Okay, are you willing to put in the hours now to enjoy and reap the rewards later? Are you willing to educate yourself? Are you willing to cut costs and do something yourself just to get the business off the ground until you can afford to hire somebody else to do it for you? And all of these things, okay? But the fear of failure often is higher than the actual chance of failure because you don't necessarily have any kind of control over the fear in some ways, and in other ways you absolutely do. But often this fear is something that is unpredictable. It's something that really can't just be saying, okay, well, this fear means that there's a 75% chance that you're going to fail. It has no correlation. It has absolutely no attachment to the physical item, the physical you're doing. The chance of failure, however, does have specific percentages aligned to it, in the sense that you really dictate what those are on your own. Because if you put in, let's just say hypothetical examples here, let's say that you're trying to get a digital agency off the ground and you do local flyer dropping. Okay, maybe you've just increased your chances 10% of getting a new client. Let's say that you start running online advertising. Let's say that kicks up your chances another 25%. Let's say that you spend lots and lots of time building an amazing website to promote it. Again, maybe that kicks your chance up 30, 35%. Okay, now these are just hypothetical numbers. Please don't quote those. Okay, but the issue here is that the chance of failure, if you do nothing, is very, very high. If you just essentially create a business and you sit there waiting for people to come to it, there's a very, 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 very low chance that you're ever going to acquire any customers. Okay, now you have decided that chance on your own. You have made that percentage happen. Okay, because you have not done anything to try and promote or drive for new business. Therefore, the chance of failure is increased. You can decrease that chance of failure by going out and doing more things. All right, so the fear of failure is often higher than the chance of failure if you put in sufficient effort. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave that presentation there for topic number 1 up on screen for you. Please do go ahead and ask any questions, jot down any notes right before we move on to topic number 2 for today. Okay. All right, now without further ado, let us move on to topic number 2, the concept. You must fail in order to progress. Okay, so we covered the rule. We covered the rule that essentially says you must not be afraid to fail. Okay, now the concept that you must fail in order to progress, let's talk about this. Okay, so without mistakes, essentially failure. Okay, now if we categorize generalized failure as making mistakes, okay, because you could say, well, a mistake is something that isn't done correctly. Therefore, we could probably look at that as a failure. Okay. Now, the first thing is, without mistakes and therefore failure, we do run the risk of an overly enlarged ego. Okay. Now, I don't mean necessarily in the terms of arrogance or, excuse me, generally being a person that's egotistical. Okay. What I mean more is essentially becoming somebody that believes that they can't fail, becoming somebody that believes that everything you do will work. Okay. Now, whilst confidence and self-belief is a wonderful and productive thing, we never want to be in the belief or the naivety that just because we're doing something that it's guaranteed to work. Because in my professional opinion, that means that if you're carrying this kind of weight that nothing you do will ever fail, you may well be setting yourself up for a painful crash. Okay, and we do not want that to happen, because when we become overconfident, we begin to overlook certain things. We put in a little bit less effort. Now, this stuff starts to happen subconsciously because we just believe that it's going to be a success. And if we begin to believe that it's just automatically going to become a success, then we're probably not analyzing competitors. We're probably not analyzing our clients, our prospects, our ideal target markets, our advertising methods, our overall marketing strategy, our finance, all that kind of stuff that we need to make sure we're looking at. All right. So without mistakes and failure, we do run the risk of an overly enlarged ego. Okay, now we don't want to carry egos with us. We don't want to ever believe that we're unstoppable in many forms of the word. Okay, confidence is very, very different to egotistical behavior. Okay, confidence says, I'm going to try my absolute best and I really believe I can do this. Okay, that's completely different to this is winning. I don't care what else happens. Okay, now being unstoppable in one sense of the word is you're going to try everything, you're going to do what you can. That's a wonderful version of being unstoppable. The sort of negative connotation of that word would mean that you believe that no matter what you do, it's going to be a success. Okay, that's slightly more negative connotation, not something we necessarily want to follow. All right, so without mistakes, and therefore failure, we won't run the risk of an overly enlarged ego. We don't want that. That is bad. Okay, so failure is humbling, and a humble attitude allows for open-mindedness and willingness to learn. Now, if you think in any given business scenario, when you're speaking to somebody, you always want to believe that if you yourself are also a professional in that particular field, that you have something to share, something that you can teach somebody else. Now, what we don't want to do is get into the belief system that we know everything and therefore we have nothing to learn. Failure is naturally a humbling situation. Okay, it allows you to learn many, many things, of course, but it also shows you that you are not necessarily unstoppable or invincible, or whatever word you want to use. It shows you that actually you can fail, you can make mistakes. You're human, just like every other human being on the planet. Now, What this does is it has a wonderful side effect where it allows us to develop a humble attitude with an open mind. We are aware that we need to learn. We are aware that we can learn from others. So we don't walk into a room full of other professionals and say, hey, I know more than you. Okay. Maybe you do about specific niches, but actually one very, very productive, one very, very positive outlook on this is when you're having a conversation with someone, your ears are listening for education. Okay. You're not turning somebody away for any reason or another. Okay. You're listening to what they have to say. Now, this is a humble attitude that can be developed as a result of not being a success every 2 seconds. Okay, it can come as a result of actually understanding that you, just like anybody else, can fail. And that's not a bad thing. Okay, as long as we have risk mitigations in place, we make sure that we're not having any catastrophic failures, but we're just having speed bumps, operational problems, things like that, things that we can iron out and things that we can continue moving forward on. There's a good chance that somebody can help you with that. Okay, now failure can welcome this wonderful, humble attitude that allows for an open mind where we listen, we learn, we educate ourselves, and we form solid, good relationships with other good people. Okay, this is not something that we can develop with arrogance. You'll find it more difficult with an arrogant attitude, with a know-it-all attitude, to actually forge strong relationships with people. Okay, so each time we make a mistake, we ensure that there is no repetition of the same mistake. Now, if we're looking at the concept here that you must fail in order to progress, we need to be very aware that each time we make the mistake, that we do actually make sure that that mistake doesn't occur again. Okay. Now, when a mistake occurs, we analyze the situation. We say, what was it that happened? What went wrong? Now, what would be a really big mistake, an even bigger mistake than the initial problem, would be if you repeat that same mistake on a regular basis. Okay. The mistake happening twice is too much. If it happens once, fair enough. You didn't know, you learn from it, you go and fix whatever that mistake was. We don't want to be repeating the same mistakes, because then that shows that we're paying lack of attention to our business or lack of effort in detail. All right. So each time we make a mistake, we do need to ensure that there is no repetition of the same mistake. Okay. This is how we learn. This is how we progress. This is how we develop. So if you've found a problem, you've analyzed the problem, you've isolated the problem, and you know that you can prevent it from happening again, please go ahead and do that, because that will help you build a stronger business, a stronger ship to sail through heavier waters. Okay, so each time we make a mistake, we analyze, we ensure that there is no repetition of the same mistake. You now have the benefit of restarting and establishing how you will repeat the process even better for the next time. Okay, if we rid ourselves of this paralyzing fear of failure, we now look at it in a positive light and we say, okay, we failed, but here's what we get to do. We get to do that thing again, whatever it is. And I don't mean restart the entire business. I mean, wherever you made the mistake, go back to the start, figure it out. Now that you've established you're not going to make that same mistake again, you can now look at the problem in a different light. You can say, well, actually, we've repaired that. We're going to go forward again, but this time we're going to go forward with more intelligence. We're going to go through with more strength. We're going to get there better, faster this time around. Okay, so you now have the benefit of restarting and establishing how you will repeat the process even better for the next time. Okay, so that now brings us to the end of topic number 2. Once again, I'm going to give you a brief moment there. Do go ahead and jot down any questions that you might have. I saw we got one in the previous topic. Thank you ever so much. I'll get that in the end. And please do go ahead and jot down any notes that you have as well, right before we dive on to the third and final topic for today. All right, moving on now to topic number 3, the outcome. Okay, increased experience and eventual success. So we've talked about the rule, we've discussed the concept, and we're going to finish with the outcome. Okay, so the outcome here, after we rid ourselves of the fear of failure, after we have looked at the concept that we must fail in order to progress, and we now look at the outcome. Okay, what do we get as a result of these things? Well, we get usually increased experience and eventual success. Okay, so every great business leader has a list of failed ideas and ventures behind them. Okay, so we discussed this early on in the webinar. We looked at people like Richard Branson, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. Okay, every great business leader has a list of failed ideas and ventures behind them. Now, this is something you absolutely must remember. This is something you absolutely must remind yourself of, because in order to be great, there's a very, very, very strong chance that you're going to have to fail at something, somewhere, somehow. Okay, because very, very rarely, if ever, does somebody get it right the first time around. Do they just hit the bullseye first time around, no questions asked? Okay, this is extraordinarily rare, if ever, happening. Okay, so every great business leader, this could include yourself one day, has a list of failed ideas and ventures behind them. Now, this could mean ventures in many different business regards. Maybe they're pursuing different businesses, different ideas. Maybe they were focusing on one business. They were trying out different ideas, different prospects, different markets. Okay, but they discover these things by doing them. Okay, they learn by doing. Largely, they also look at their education. They look at what they know. They look at their skill sets. They put the right people around them in order to build a successful business entity. Okay, but every great business leader has a list of failed ideas and ventures behind them. And you need to remind yourself of this the next time you feel yourself scared, you feel yourself a little bit panicked, and you don't really know where to go. Just think, relax. It's natural to make mistakes. It's natural to fail. Okay, we don't want to hit massive catastrophic failures. We need to use our education and our skill set to try and avoid these as best we can. But for the most part, it's not unusual to have a couple of little mistakes and failures along the line, okay, if not more. Now, from each failed idea, they diagnose what went wrong and they use it to their advantage, okay? They use this as education, they use this as experience, they look at it to essentially weaponize themselves to become more intelligent entrepreneurs, better individuals in professional light. They can develop better businesses, they can run better tactics, they have better strategies going forward. They wield it to their advantage and they essentially understand how to not make that mistake again. But not only this, they've understood how to make themselves stronger as professionals and individuals. They've understood how to make them stronger as business entities as well. So from each failed idea, they diagnose what went wrong. Now, this is the crucial part, the crucial thing that they do here. If something didn't work, they want to know why. They don't just say, oh, well, that didn't work, let's just forget about it. They look at it and say, well, at the time, we thought it was a brilliant idea. So let's go back, reassess why it didn't work. Okay, now it can be painful, it can be boring, it can be almost discouraging to go back and see why something didn't work, but it is incredibly valuable to continue to gather this data and figure out why something didn't work, because once you know how then you can turn it around and use it to your advantage. Now, experience combined with education is a lethal combination in the business world. Okay, this is something that can be so incredibly effective and amazing if you look at your experience, combine that with the education that you have. So education, of course, can come from experience, okay? And experience can come in many ways from education as well, if you learn by doing, all right? But they couple with each other. You're always educating yourself. You're keeping yourself up to date. You're learning the newest, latest, and greatest strategies. You're following successful entrepreneurs in your field. You're seeing what they're doing. You're seeing how it's working for them, okay? You couple this with the experience that you have, the mistakes that you've made, the failures that you've overcome, it becomes a lethal combination in the business world, because you understand that you need to be tough to overcome these failures, these mistakes, okay? Your experience kicks in and it says, hey, look, something similar has happened before. We're not going down. We're going to be great. We're going to be better than great. We're going to progress, okay? You combine this with the education that you have, the education that you continually give yourself, it becomes a lethal combination, because you do, in a positive sense of the word, become unstoppable. Okay, you believe very much in yourself, you believe very much in your system, not from blind faith, but simply from understanding what works and what works right now. Okay, so if you keep learning, keep developing, and keep improving, you will reach staged and elevated levels of success. Okay, now in business, in any form of the word, there is never a guarantee, but you increase your chances dramatically if you are trying your best to learn from your mistakes, you educate yourself, you're aware of what's happening in the market that you're in, all these different factors you're analyzing all the time, you strive to be the best individual in your field in what you do, there's a very strong chance that you will begin to reach staged and elevated levels of success. Now, staged means, okay, stage one, let's say you take your agency to 50K, stage two, 100, stage three, 150, and so on and so forth. Elevated levels here, as we say just there, 50, 100, 150, 300, 500, they're elevated stages and levels. Okay, and this is something that you will very likely experience if you look at the facts that we've covered in today's webinar and you use this information to drive yourself forward. Okay, so once again, I'm going to give you a brief moment now to jot down any questions, any notes you might have from the third and final topic of today. Okay, and then we're going to dive on to the Q&A session that we always do at the end, and we'll do that very briefly. Okay, wonderful. So hopefully you've had a moment now. Okay, so to recap on today's session, number one, if you're afraid to fail, you may never get started. This is so incredibly true and something you must remind yourself of. Number two, failure is part of your progression. Okay, if you do not fail, you do not make mistakes, it's something that, well, in fact, sorry, let me rephrase that. If you're not willing to fail, if you're not willing to make mistakes, then there's a very, very slim chance that you will progress. And finally, every mistake or failure builds experience. So look at it in a positive light as a learning curve, as opposed to a dramatic failure. Okay. Now, as always, a huge thank you for attending today's session. You'd be more than welcome to talk to a member of our team if you'd like to head over to iob-business.com/talk-to-us. Then you can go ahead and book a call at a time that suits you. I'm going to leave the link up on the screen. I'm going to leave the calendar up on the screen for you, okay, whilst I go ahead and grab your questions from today's session. Okay, so question number one, how do I diagnose a failure? All right, awesome question. Here is my answer to you, okay? So diagnosing a failure sure can be unpleasant, okay? But you must face the music. You got to be brutally honest with yourself. Do this briefly and don't dwell on it, okay? But act quickly to implement a fresh method so that you can move on, all right? This is really how I would look at it personally. I wouldn't dwell on it and I wouldn't spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours inside analyzing the mistake. But as soon as I understand why it happened and what it was that occurred, what caused the situation to occur in the first place, I could certainly then move forward with a clearer mind and say, actually, I'm going to take this to my advantage. I'm going to implement a fresh method and we're going to move on. All right. So that in essence is how you diagnose a failure. I hope that was useful and a fantastic question. Thank you so much. Next question. Okay. Can you clarify what you mean again by overly enlarged ego? Of course. Okay. So if we never or literally never believe that we can make mistakes, we do begin to believe that we may be perfect or incapable of making mistakes. All right. We do then run the risk of falsely inflated confidence leading to a larger crash, essentially. Okay. Now, what we don't want to happen is a belief that we can never make any mistakes ever. And essentially, that's what we mean by an enlarged ego here. Okay. Because confidence is a wonderful thing, but ego, cockiness, things like that, we want to avoid that in business in general, because we then potentially cut off vision. We almost, you know, in a hypothetical sense of the word, we can't see what's happening in front of us. Because if we believe that we already know everything, we believe that we can't make any mistakes, we actually then ironically lead ourselves to a bigger crash, because potentially something that could have been avoided if we were willing to listen and willing to learn. And again, so I hope that helps. And another amazing question. Thank you ever so much for asking. Let me just do a final check. Those are the two questions that I can see from today. But let me just do a quick check and see if we have any more. All right, looks like that is all the questions that we have for today. So as always, a massive thank you for attending. It's been an absolute pleasure presenting to you today, and I very much look forward to seeing you again on the next IOB business webinar 2 weeks from now. Take care and have a wonderful week.